It's certainly very hostile on our college campuses these days when someone introduces me as a speaker and says, well, you know, he's a conservative Christian teaching at a public university. The immediate reaction to that is, you can't be serious. I didn't know that they actually allowed them on our college campuses. And so I actually am often asked, you know, how that came about. And so I then have to tell people, explain to people that I was in fact a very left-wing atheist at some point in my life. And then of course that leads on to the question of, well, how did you change basically, and why did you change? So this evening, or this afternoon I should say, Nathan actually asked me to come speak, and I asked him beforehand, what should I talk about? He said, well, just tell your conversion story and then tell us what you've been up to since then. So I'd like to actually share my story with you because I think it just speaks volumes about what is wrong with our universities today, and also what is wrong with the church and what's lacking and what we need to do as Christians who are called not to respond to the culture, but instead to influence it. I was brought into UNCW in 1993 as a very left-wing atheist, and I was one of those intolerant atheists who, as a matter of fact, would go into the main office at the criminology department at UNCW, where we had a Christian, a secretary, who would actually listen to Christian music there throughout the day, and I would actually tell her when I walked into the office to turn down the Christian music so I didn't ever have to hear it in the office. So I was one of those who was often talking about the importance of diversity and inclusion and tolerance, but who was living a very different worldview at that time. Well, how did things change? In 1994, I was dating a woman from Ecuador, and the relationship got kind of serious, and we all know how that is when a relationship gets serious. At some point, you have to go meet the parents. And that's usually a very awkward moment. It's extremely awkward when they live in South America and you can't speak Spanish very well. So I actually had to go down there, travel down to Ecuador and go meet Marisol's parents. And while I was down there one evening, we were actually having dinner in a sidewalk cafe basically in Guayaquil, Ecuador. And we were with this other couple, and the guy in the other couple actually was an attorney. And he found out that I was a criminologist, and he started to talk about the horrific conditions in the prisons there in Ecuador. And I started to hear stories from him that were so unusual, I thought they couldn't possibly be true. And so after I came back from Ecuador, I actually arranged through UNCW a teaching exchange where I would go back down there and teach for 17 days. But my real reason was that I actually wanted to get inside one of the prisons and go in there and actually try to interview some of the prison guards and officials working in the prison and some of the prisoners. And so I was actually able to arrange that. And I had a life-changing day on March 7th back in 1996 when I walked into that prison just to do a tour for a few hours. I actually had a couple of English-speaking guards walking with me because, you know, my English was just terrible, plus I needed to be protected. And we actually walked into a cell that had 45 men packed into 36 square meters. You had rapists and murderers and people who had simply engaged in petty larceny, all of them there in the same jail cell. After that, we actually went walking through the kitchen. I was taken on a full tour to see how they were fed, and I realized they would take old rotten meat and rotten vegetables from the old town square in Old Town Quito, and they'd actually cut them up and throw them in vats to kill the insects, basically. And they would actually serve this to the prisoners. It was actually just horrific. There was human waste all over the prison, broken pipes, and it was just absolutely terrible. And as I was walking through that kitchen, I actually was walking through this little room, and I actually witnessed a beating of a young man who was being held up against a wall by a couple of prison guards, and they're actually beating him with a small bat. So hard you could actually hear the cracking sound of them striking his ribs. And at the time they were beating him, I had no idea why they were doing it, but later on I figured out why. Those prisoners had to pay rent to stay in the prison. They had to pay 67 cents per week to stay downstairs, but if they were able to raise $1.67 a week, they got to stay upstairs, and one of the advantages was they only had 20 people packed into a cell instead of 45 people. and I realized that there were people out there in the streets holding buckets, and they were basically beating on them and asking for donations so that they could pay the rent of their family members who were staying there in the prison. And I finally realized that that guy wanted to eat, but he hadn't paid his rent yet. So they were actually beating him with a club. So I had that experience of witnessing that firsthand when I was downstairs. Shortly after that, I went upstairs, and I was able to talk to some of the prisoners there who had the advantage of being able to bring in personal effects and to have their own bunks. And I actually went in there and sat down and talked to one of only 2 English-speaking prisoners there in the prison that I would meet that day. One of them actually had a Bible and a picture of Jesus, and he was Catholic, and I sat down and was talking to him, and he was telling me the story of how he was arrested 2 years before for petty larceny. It was an offense that only carried a sentence of 2 months, and he was still waiting on his trial to take place. And after that conversation was over, he actually looked at me and said, with tremendous gratitude, he said, "I want to thank you for coming in here to talk to me, because no one knows about us down here. No one even cares about us." And I realized his heart was actually full of gratitude. And it was interesting because I got the sense that this guy was there in the prison, but he had a peace about him that I actually didn't have. And in some ways, I kind of thought that I was a prisoner and he was actually a free man. And I went on from that conversation and had another one with a guy named Pedro Castillo, who had been in prison for 4 years. He had just been acquitted of a charge of misdemeanor forgery. His trial took 3 years to commence, 1 year to finish, and afterwards, after he had been acquitted, he was having to raise a processing fee to pay to the guards to get out. It was a bribe, and his family was sitting there trying to raise that bribe for a period of 3 weeks. And I had this long conversation with him, and then finally, after all of that was over, I got a chance to talk to those prison guards. And they asked me what I was talking about at the university. And I was actually giving a series of lectures on that exchange about the death penalty, because Ecuador was considering bringing back the death penalty. They'd gotten rid of it in 1958. This was in 1996, and it was on the ballot, and they were considering it. And I asked them, I said, "Do you think they're going to bring back the death penalty in Ecuador?" They actually laughed at me, and they said, "We still have the death penalty." I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "When we've got a child molester or we've got a head of a drug cartel, we'll just walk up to them and tell them that there was a mistake in their arrest and they're free to go. And we open up the prison gates, and as soon as they walk outside in the courtyard, we shoot them in the back with a machine gun. We go and bury their bodies, and we tell the warden that it was a thwarted escape attempt." Incredible. I'd heard stories of them wrapping wires around the genitalia of suspects in the back of police vans and actually interrogating them and running that wire into the van battery. And every single time they denied committing the crime, turning the key until they confessed. And as I was talking to those guards actually admitted that that was a common practice. By the way, when I asked them if they actually shot anyone, they said no, it was the other guards who did it. Right, I'm like, you should probably run for office. You'd make a great politician in America. But after that experience was over, and just talking to those folks and witnessing those conditions firsthand for about 3 hours, I went walking out of the prison. It's interesting. If you go to this very small prison, only houses about 1,000 prisoners there in Quito, the thing you see when you walk out of the prison is actually a statue of the Virgin Mary that's up on a hill. And I remember walking out of that prison that day. It was drizzling rain, and just saying to myself after the tour was over, I was wrong about being an atheist. You see, I had a worldview before that I'd gotten at the university in, pursuing a degree in sociology. It was a worldview of cultural relativism that said we are not supposed to judge other cultures by the standards of our own culture. And I realized that day that ideas have consequences. And that was a worldview that didn't work very well in reality when you were confronted with evil. If it's true that we're not supposed to judge other cultures by the standards of our own culture, then it would have been wrong for us to liberate the Nazi concentration camps, because that would have been imposing our cultural values, anti-genocidal values, upon the Nazis. And that was my realization that day. It's actually reflected in a song by Switchfoot called The Shadow Proves the Sunshine, which was actually said a little bit better, I think, once by the Christian apologist C.S. Lewis. He said, "You only know if a line is crooked when it's held next to a straight line." And you see, that's the realization I came to that day. By actually looking at abject evil and seeing it, I realized that the existence of evil shows us that there has to be good. There has to be an absolute moral authority out there, because shooting people in the back without due process isn't wrong, just wrong in America, or just wrong in Latin America, or just wrong in the Middle East. It's not just wrong in the 30s or the 40s or the 50s. It's timelessly wrong, because there is an absolute moral authority out there. And that day had a huge, huge impact upon my professional life. The way that I wrote about our culture, the way that I wrote about our system of justice, the way that I felt about our country was all profoundly impacted by that experience, because my worldview had changed. But you see, that day, I didn't become a Christian. I only became a theist at that point. And so it really didn't translate into a transformation of my life, my moral life, the way that I live from day to day. And I would go on floating out there for a few years until I had another fascinating experience in a prison. I was in another foreign country known as Texas. I can say that because I was raised there. And I actually had an opportunity to go. My dad was a former, he had been a programmer for NASA, and he'd gone to work for the criminal justice system out there in Huntsville as a programmer. He'd kind of taken a retirement job, if you will, and knew the warden very well. And there was a very, very famous Supreme Court, subject of a Supreme Court opinion, a guy by the name of John Paul Penry, who had an IQ of 53, by the way, and he was about to be executed. His case had gone to the Supreme Court twice, and I realized he was about to be executed, and I made a plea to actually interview him face to face. And because my dad was friends with the warden, that was sped through and it was granted. And I got to go in on December 30th of 1999 and have about a 3-hour conversation with the subject of one of the most famous Supreme Court cases in American history, John Paul Penry. And we talked about his case, the complications, the constitutional issues that were involved in it for a few hours. And none of that has anything to do with the present lecture, so I'll get to the point. At the end of that discussion about his case, as I got up to walk off of death row, I reached my hand out and touched the glass and kind of did the death row handshake as I was leaving. John Paul Penry, with an IQ of 53, quoted John 3:16 to me. And I couldn't believe it, because he stammered his way through it, and he botched it a little bit, of course, because of his mental handicap. And I stopped in my tracks and I turned to him and I said, "Johnny, you've read the Bible. You've learned how to read and you've read the Bible." And he says, "Well, there wasn't much else to do here on death row for 20-something years. And he says, "Yeah, I did." And I thought that was interesting, because I went walking off of death row. And that day I realized I'm a tenured college professor, and I've never read the Bible. How can I possibly call myself an educated person if I've never read the Bible? And this guy with a 53 IQ has read the whole thing. And so I went to Barnes & Noble here in Wilmington, and I got a copy of the King James Version. Big mistake. I decided I'm going to start with the King James Version. And I went walking up to the desk there. It was about 11:30, or about 10:30 at night. It was very close to closing hours. And I went walking up there, and one of my students was behind the counter. And I turned around and put that Bible back, because I didn't want anyone to know that I was considering Christianity. So I came back the next day, grabbed the King James, walked up to the counter and bought it from a perfect stranger. And so I started reading it in January, and I'm moving through this process in the year 2000. And what a mistake it was to start with the King James. I hit Leviticus and I just started to have levititis. I mean, I just felt like I was floating in the air. I was reading about all this treatment of bumps and things like that. And I said, "Man, I think I need to break this up into parts and stop and maybe just go read some apologetics book by some Christian." I went into the UNCW library and walked upstairs into the religion section and found a book by Chuck Colson called "How Now Shall We Live?" And I opened up to page 1 of chapter 1. and he is describing his experience in a prison in Quito, Ecuador. And I start to read that book. I said, that's got to be a sign. I've got to read this thing. And I start reading, and I realize he keeps talking about C.S. Lewis over and over and over again. And so when I hit kind of the next bump in the road, if you will, I think it was probably around Ezekiel and temple dimensions or something like that. I was like, oh my goodness, I need a break. I actually went and got Mere Christianity. I remember the conversation back when I was in graduate school. I was a musician. I was drunk and high one evening playing a gig at a bar called The Gin up at Ole Miss in Oxford, Mississippi, when an undergraduate Christian friend of mine walked up and confronted me. And he said, you know what? He said, you're too smart to be an atheist. The only reason that you're an atheist is because you haven't examined the evidence. You haven't considered it. If you read a book called Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, you would be a former atheist. I remembered that conversation, and I read that book, and he kept talking about this voice that you hear, a voice that tells you to do wrong, another one that tells you to do right, and this voice in the background, which is the absolute moral authority. And I realized what C.S. Lewis was writing about was the experience that I had in that prison down in South America. And so I just continued the process. I went through, finished the King James, and after I did that, it took me about 9 months to get through the King James. But I read about 6 different apologetics. I read some things by J.P. Moreland and by Norm Geisler. And at the end of the journey, I converted to Christianity because I decided that Christianity was true. It was based upon the evidence that I made that decision. And so that's how I went through that conversion process. And I want you guys to know, of course, that once I converted to Christianity back in the year 2000, all of my problems were solved. And my life became completely easy, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, if you've read the newspaper over the last few years, you realize that I just said something that wasn't true. Many of you realize, of course, that after I converted in the year 2000, I decided that I was going to turn against my former self and this censorious anti-free speech mentality, anti-Christian mentality that's exhibited so often by college professors and college administrators. And I decided to start writing a column initially for the American Family Association. After that, I got an invitation to write for townhall.com. I've recently switched over to the Daily Wire, and I'm now working for Ben Shapiro and writing about exactly the same issues on our college campuses. But I started to address those issues, and the result of that was an individual who had won University Professor of the Year twice out at UNCW. After I converted to Christianity and started to speak out about that stuff in the year 2006, I was actually denied a promotion to full professor, and they actually said the reason was I was deficient in every single area of teaching, research, and service. And so as a result of that, of course, I launched into a litigation against the university, and I want to mention it just very briefly before I end this on a positive note. We are often confused about what's going on our campuses. I hear people all the time say that these college administrators, these crazy liberals who are running the universities, well, you know, they're ignorant of the First Amendment. Let me be as clear as I possibly can. These people are not ignorant of the First Amendment. They are at war with the First Amendment, and they are at war with our individual liberties. In my case, they actually tried to make the argument that the columns that I wrote, as soon as I mentioned them on my promotion application, that they actually lost all First Amendment protection and that the university could engage in viewpoint discrimination in the promotion process out there. I am so very thankful for an organization called the Alliance Defending Freedom, which exists out there in Arizona, Scottsdale, Arizona, because those individuals represented me free of charge for 7 years. And we went out there and we defeated the university, and in the process, we ran off from UNCW a number of those administrators who were involved in that wrongdoing. And we won a very big settlement in that case. We set a very important precedent. I know that the Alliance Defending Freedom was awarded almost $750,000 in attorney's fees. And because we stood up and did the right thing in that case, it sent a message. And I want to end that part of the lecture on a very positive note. Many of you have heard a lot of negative things about things going on at the university over the course of the last couple of decades, about some of the phony diversity, about some of the anti-Christian sentiment and some of the policies that have existed there on the campus. I am so excited to tell you that we finally have one of the good guys in charge of UNCW. That new chancellor, Jose Sartorelli, that we have hired. UNCW can be proud. We have got one of the best chancellors in the United States of America. He is a conservative, he is friendly towards Christians, and already in the span of less than a year and a half, he has taken a principled stand for free speech on numerous occasions out at UNCW. And I want to urge all of you, I want to suggest to you that possibly in the coming months, in the coming years, he might possibly come under fire for doing some principled things that might not be popular at the university. I want all of you to pay attention to what is going on out there, and please do me a favor and lend him your support. Because he is the best thing that's ever happened to that university, and we've been able to accomplish some positive things out there, despite the fact, I don't want you guys to think that this is an area where we can't possibly succeed as Christians. As Christians, we are called to engage the enemy on their own turf and to influence the culture for Christ. We are supposed to be active, not responding to the culture, but actually shaping the culture. And that leads to the two other things that I'm doing right now that I want to mention to you that I think are so important. We are on 9-month contracts at UNCW, and I teach my courses there at UNCW basically from the middle of August into the middle of May, and we're all given 3 months to do whatever we want to do. I have decided to spend the last 8 years teaching out at a place called Summit Ministries, which is a worldview training camp out there in Manitou Springs, Colorado. Rick, your son went out there. Rick Graves is here, and your son went out there once or twice. That is the best possible investment that you can make in your children and your grandchildren, because I know that he came back and was very involved in some activism on our campus in advancing the pro-life message. Also, Tom Jaski is here, and Nathan mentioned a speech that I gave at UNCW on the life issue a couple of years ago. Tom has been working and leading that Ratio Christi chapter on our campus for the past few years. And by the way, he is the one who is responsible for helping to set up that event and initiating that thing and organizing it in the first place. So I want all of you to get familiar with the work that we're doing at Summit Ministries. I'm very serious about that. If you are concerned about a family member that you have, a son, a grandson, about someone going off to college and losing their faith, the best thing you can do is send them to a place like Summit Ministries out in Manitou Springs, Colorado, so they can learn how to defend their faith. That's the reason why I fell away as a college freshman and was susceptible to very bad ideas, such as the idea that we shouldn't judge other cultures by the standards of our own culture. The reason for that is when I was young, my dad was an atheist, my mother was a fundamentalist Baptist. I went to church, but my church wasn't teaching a Christian worldview and why it's true and why it is worth defending. The reason why, and I want to conclude on this note in terms of what I've been up to, the reason why I've been in California the last 3 weeks, and the reason why I've been traveling on the weekends all across the country, is that I've connected with a couple of fantastic Christian apologists by the name of Frank Turek from Charlotte, North Carolina, and J. Warner Wallace, who wrote Cold Case Christianity. Many of you have seen his videos and probably read his books before, but he is a former homicide detective who was an atheist who investigated the claims of Christ and the eyewitness testimony and converted and became a Christian apologist. We spend our weekends traveling across the country and doing these events at churches because we have realized that there is a thirst out there. The church is beginning to wake up and realize that we are losing too many of our young people when we send them off to college. The statistics indicate today that about 75% of Christians who go off to college will fall away from the church their freshman year. And we have got to do something about that, Christian men. We have got to start preparing our kids to function in these hostile environments. And the best way that we can do that is to start to bring apologetics training into our churches. And so I really hope and pray that some of you who are here today will take the time to visit Frank Turek's website. Go to crossexamine.org and look at all the fantastic videos that he's got and lectures and Q&As that he's got that help to teach Christians how to answer difficult questions and defend the Christian faith. But also, take a look at the section of the website that describes our Fearless Faith seminars. I travel all across the country doing these things. I would love to have an opportunity to do one of those at one of the big churches right here in Wilmington, because I believe that this is a real spiritual battleground here in Wilmington. But I believe that we are finally, after years of toil, because we have a good chancellor, because we have a good chapter called Ratio Christi over at UNCW, we are beginning to make some progress. And I would just close in asking the churches to get involved in apologetics and to get involved in the marketplace of ideas. Consider hosting one of these conferences. And I really appreciate you guys allowing me to be with you here today. Thank you so much.
Questions for Brother Mike?
I got the
And
microphone
while
here.
you're thinking, I have one word in response. Wow. That was just phenomenal. Thank you, brother, for bringing it to us.
Thank you.
Questions real quickly.
What was that website you said?
I'm seeing a red light here, so I'll take this.
fine.
Okay. Frank's website is crossexamine.org. And I really admire Frank because for years, he was actually fired by Bank of America and Cisco. He used to be a management consultant, and they had found out that he wrote a book defending traditional marriage, and they fired him. And I'm not kidding. In the name of tolerance, diversity, and inclusion, they fired him. And so as soon as he did that, he decided that he was going to take his part-time business of crossexamine.org and he was going to go full-time. All he does is to go to hostile college campuses, and he goes and he does these presentations called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist presentations. And he also does Q&As with the atheist, and he stands there. There will be 50 atheists in the audience, and they will stand in line taking shots at him. He prevails every time, and better than that, he records videos, and he puts them on the website. And there are many of the things, if you're worried about a kid of yours going off to college and experiencing that kind of thing, it's a glimpse into what it's going to be like when he goes into the lion's den. And so it's a very helpful website. And I think you go to /FF for Fearless Faith, and it gives the schedule and explains how we do what we do. Yes?
Rick Grace has a question.
Yes, Rick.
On Summit Ministries, could you give just a couple seconds on a little bit more about that detail?
Yes.
Really transforming, and maybe a couple examples of what some young people have changed with that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I met your son that summer. Within months, he's there working with Ratio Christi, and he's out there doing the pro-life activism. And I saw in your son, not only this ability to defend his faith, but this view that it was his obligation to go out there and help transform the culture. And we try to do that in a span of about 2 weeks. And so we have them in for roughly 12 days worth of lectures. It sounds tough because they're in the classroom for 4 or 5 hours a day, but then it's in Colorado. So we get to go out and hike and do some things outdoors as well. But they're exposed to not just apologetics in general, but also worldview. And the difference, of course, is worldview, it's a broader issue. We argue that there are 6 major worldviews that are competing for world domination out there, and we just try and explain what are the differences between them. So we go beyond just what is right about Christianity and what's true and how do you defend it, to identifying the weaknesses in the other worldviews. Because this is a mistake we make when it comes to dealing with atheists. We think an atheist is a person without theism. That's incomplete. They're not just without theism. They're also in possession of some other false worldview. And they're trying to spread that to your kids. And so what we try to do is teach them how to navigate the worldviews. And so we have people like Sean McDowell and J.P. Moreland and Geisler. It was wonderful, by the way, to be reading those guys when I converted and joined them on the faculty at Summit 8 years after that. It was fantastic. But we also have had Nabil Qureshi and many people. Josh McDowell has spoken for us out there on many occasions. So we'll dance around beyond apologetics into specific topics like creationism and also pro-life apologetics. We always do that kind of training every year. Yes, fire away.
How old can, like 15 to 17?
16.
16?
16. although we've made exceptions before, and I'm glad a number of years ago we made an exception for a young 14-year-old named Lila Rose. Many of you might have heard of her, and she went, and that's one of the things that lit a fire under her to get involved in pro-life apologetics. Yes, fire away.
My wife and my son got married and just started UNCW this last year.
Yes.
And I will tell you, I was horrified because
Right.
both had to go through this video that was online. It was an orientation. Are you familiar with it? It's horrific.
Which horrific video?
It just has to do with like all types of gender.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's so warped. I cringed going through it with her, and I don't know if there's any way to stop that, but it's the first thing they have to go through.
Right. We are beginning to make. If you could send a link to me, if you can find that, or I'll go and try and find that on the website myself. Make no mistake, there's still some very bad things going on at UNCW, microaggression training and stuff like that they do during orientation. But we have had 8 of our 9 unconstitutional speech codes eliminated from UNCW since Jose Sartorelli became the chancellor, and we're about to get the 9th one taken care of pretty soon after that chalking controversy occurred on campus. Many of you may have read about. So I have confidence that we're going to be able to go and clean up some of that other ridiculousness as well, because that's not the kind of thing that the university has to do. And so I think we're just going to take it, one at a time. And we really, if we could just cut out some of that unnecessary indoctrination, we could just be different. I mean, people are not asking for a university where they go and only their traditional ideas are being promulgated. They're just asking to be free from non-stop gender and sexual politics and racial politics and identity politics. And so that's something I'd be interested in addressing with the Board of Trustees and with the Chancellor. They're listening now, and we have a good board as well. So thanks for bringing that to my attention. Yes? Yes?
So you came in as in UNCW as a neo-atheist and had all these friends there on that side. Now that you've had your conversion, have you been able to influence some of these other professors to what the truth is that you now believe, and have you gone and apologized to their secretary?
Oh, yeah. Oh, we have a really good relationship. It was interesting after the conversion. She just wept. Well, I'm sorry. He was asking basically, have I been able to have an influence on some of the other professors there? Yeah, I've seen some of that as well. But here's the thing: when you're a Christian professor on a college campus and you're dealing with people who aren't just lost, they're Pharisees. They're not individuals who just don't know the truth. They're individuals who know the truth and are teaching falsity intentionally. And so one thing to realize for the conservative Christian who decides he wants to come out of the closet, if you will, on the campus and actually share the gospel, it might not be the case that you can influence the faculty, because for many of them, their hearts are too hardened. But you know what? There are a lot of lost people who witness the exchanges. And that's why we do things like the pro-life events on the campus, by the way, is we have so many people who are sort of there in the middle. And when they see one side defending the truth and the other side responding with ad hominem, I think that has a tremendous influence upon them. So I hope that answers your question.
I think we
Yes.
got one more over here.
Okay. Yes. Right. Right. Well, the safe zone is just an example of one of those campus policies that it sounds good, but it's really meant to set up an area where you engage in viewpoint discrimination, essentially where certain ideas are banned. And I just don't think that should ever happen on a college campus. I think that every campus, 100% of the acreage on every campus should be a safe zone for free speech, not for certain people based upon their identity, based upon their sexual choices. And so it sounds good, but it's code. And fortunately, we are in a position where we have a very different leadership now as opposed to Mizzou. You saw the safe zone controversy that occurred last year. In a safe zone, isn't it interesting to see a journalism professor telling other people in Black Lives Matter in that organization to go and strong-arm reporters to keep them out of the safe zone because they don't have a right to be there? It's actually very Orwellian. So, yeah, those are just examples. Safe zones are examples of sort of combining speech zones and and speech codes on campus just to engage in systematic viewpoint discrimination. Those policies are everywhere, and that's one of the reasons why I appreciate having Sartorelli, is we're beginning to reverse that, at least at UNCW. Yes, thank you. Appreciate it.